Welcome to the Deal by Me podcast, where we ask guests to tell us your story. Hello there, this is Dr. James W. Smith, your host. We seek to transform lives by encouraging and inspiring. Someone encouraged and inspired this host, a former lawyer, gambler, inmate, and his life was transformed. Same can happen to you. So when you're listening to any of the Deal by Me podcasts, please support this podcast with a donation or a monthly recurring amount for as little as $3. If you're viewing any of the podcasts on YouTube, please subscribe. To supporters of this podcast, we say thank you. Check out my encouraging, inspiring, and transforming books. I'm available for speaking engagements, in person and virtual seminars. So please contact me through my website, www.dealbyme.com. I have with me Dr. Michael J. Hession, who says that his journey to becoming a physician is marked by resilience and deep empathy, shaped not only by academic achievements, but also by profound personal experiences. He endured two near death encounters and health challenges, and he emerged with a profound understanding of human frailty, enriching his medical practice with unique empathy. I am excited to have Dr. Hession come and share with us on this podcast. Uh, Dr. Hession, do you mind if I call you Michael? We could be very, uh, I guess, informal on the podcast today. You can feel free to call me James or what have you if you wish, and it'll be fine.
That's fine with me. Thank you,
Oh,
James.
okay. All right. Dr. Michael, this is a very interesting profile and bio that I've read on you. It shares so much, and I know we won't be able to get through it all, but I'm hoping that you can share with listeners of this podcast some really great information. I know that you have written a book entitled Physician Heal Thyself. And we're going to get into it a little bit more about your story. But first of all, can you share with us what inspired you to write your book, and why did you decide to share such a deeply personal story? And I'm saying that because I've shared my story in two of my uh, books, and sometimes you can really get very personal, but there's something about it that seems to be transforming. And I'm just trying to figure out what is it with you that caused you to do the same thing.
A great question. So the events that I described in my book really culminated on December 31st, 2013. And I was hospitalized with pneumonia and acute respiratory distress syndrome and required life support. It was a very difficult and painful journey, which I'll get into later. But what inspired me to write the book was really something very different. Um, During the pandemic in January of 2020, I had just had my hip replaced and I was at home and pretty much confined to a very small space. And had a lot of time on my hands. And my wife asked me to clean out a couple of drawers that were overflowing with junk. And I came across some journals that I'd written. Starting in high school at Boston College High School, I had started journaling, not a daily diary, but as thoughts came to me or impressions, I would write them down. And I had written down a lot of what happened in the course of my illness, my illnesses, and I started rereading them. And at the time, my son Michael was a third-year resident at NYU and doing a rotation in in New York during the pandemic, and we would talk to him on a fairly regular basis, and he would describe the absolute dystopian horror of walking to Bellevue Hospital every day and seeing the refrigerated morgue trucks. And when he left, there'd be several more, and then when he came back, there would be more still. And the news was saturated with what was going on. These people on ventilators, many of them dying,
Mm,
having very long roads to recovery. And I felt, quite honestly, very helpless. I felt like I needed to do something. And it came to me that I did have something. I could share my experience of what it was like to have acute respiratory distress syndrome, prolonged ventilation, mechanical life support, and then a grueling recovery.
mm,
Um, and I started it, and it took a long time, but it became very, as you said, very deeply personal. And I tried to normalize the experience of what many of these patients were going through
mm,
and their families. Um, I trained very hard to be a physician, and I became a very good physician. But it was the experience of being a patient that actually I think made me a better physician and a better person.
mm.
And it took me a while to write the book. It was interrupted several times with more illness, and um, but now it's coming out next month, August 13th.
Uh, Dr. Hession, I am, I guess I'm just so touched by what you're saying and identify with it so much. So you really uh, touching me as you talk because I practiced law for years myself, and then I had a real um, I called unfortunate situation that happened to me that caused me to be confined for 5 years. And it was out of that experience that got me to where I am now and pastoring for over 32 years, now working as an interim pastor, even at my home church. So I feel your story. I know exactly where you're coming from. But as you have talked and are talking about this, as it was with me, there still were moments of fear, moments of hopelessness, uh, and also moments of resilience. So, in your situation, how did you navigate these emotions? And and can I ask you just what kept you going during these dark moments? Because in my life there were certainly dark moments. What kept you going?
What kept me going is an excellent question. Um, I wanted to live for my
Mm,
wife,
mm,
and getting back to her was paramount. She's not only my wife, but my soulmate, and she inspired me in many ways and has helped me become the man I am now. There were many dark days.
mm,
Um, I The experience of being on life support, uh, intubated on a ventilator is beyond terrifying. Um, Time stood still. Time
mm,
was no longer a dimension. I could not tell whether it was day or night. I did not know what day it was or what time it was. I couldn't even really see that well because I couldn't wear my contact lenses and I didn't have my glasses with me. So all I could do was hear. And that sense became very heightened.
mm,
And I could hear every morning the team, the physicians and nurses talking about me, what they were going to do. As a physician, I knew I was in serious trouble, that my life expectancy was very poor, less than 50%, probably closer to 25%. And I knew how to be a doctor. I didn't know how to be a patient. And that loss of control was very difficult.
Mm,
Um, the fear of death was terrifying. It was with me um, throughout the experience. Um, at one point, when I was after being suctioned, I could feel myself just slipping away, and it's a hard experience to describe. I could hear crying in the distance,
mm,
and I looked back and I saw the tear-stained, distorted faces of my wife and my children, and I felt a stronger force pulling me away. And I tried hard to fight to stay alive, but I knew at that moment that I was dying, and began to be pulled by a very strong force into the darkness. Felt my body become cold, and then I was drifting in the
mm,
darkness. And at some point, I became aware of a light. I drew closer to it, and these
mm,
words were said, "I am Michael. It is not your time.
mm,
You must
mm.
go back. You have much to do." And I felt my body become warmer again. And then the next thing I knew, my wife was talking into my left ear, telling me what had happened, that I had a pneumonia that got very bad and ended up on life support, was transferred from our hospital I worked at for many years and I wasn't responding to treatment into a Boston teaching hospital for ECMO, which is a
Mhm,
extracorporeal membrane
mm,
perfusion and essentially an artificial lung.
mm.
And after that feeling of near death, I felt no longer terrified of death. Um, there were a lot of painful experiences to come, and they were hard to get through.
Mhm.
Some of them stretched my limits of sanity. I found at times there were moments when I thought I was losing my mind, and I kept. I knew that if I kept thinking about the situation as it was, that I would get myself into a very bad place.
Okay.
I remember reading books by Viktor Frankl and Admiral Stockdale that when you're in a horrible situation, if you focus on the past or the unbearable present, that you could lose hope and die. The best advice they had was people who could look to the future were more likely to survive. So in my mind, I began to just plan for the future. Up to that point, I had been, saying
Mhm.
songs in my head, trying to remember everything. If I forgot a verse, I would find myself getting upset. I would say every poem that I could remember, my favorite being Robert Frost shopping by the woods in a snowy
Mm.
evening.
Yeah. Yeah.
But my brother one night was talking about a house he was building, and I landed on that. It was a very active and engaging exercise where I could plan for the future. It was a very complicated thing, planning out where I was going to site the house, how it was going to be constructed, what it was going to look like, what every
Mhm.
room was going to look like, the furniture, the hardscape, and it was totally engrossing, and it kept me sane.
Okay.
And you know, also I planned trips in the future with my wife. So looking to the future was the key.
Okay. Let me interrupt you a little bit here because I know when went through my difficulties, I was at the mental hospital. Uh, as a matter of fact, I was ordered to go there for a 6 week observation, and it was there that my faith kicked in. My mom was very committed Christian. She was a committed Christian and been in church all my life, but I was not the person that I am now. But it was in that situation that's I was able to grab hold of something. And so I noticed in your uh bio that you talk a little bit about faith. how important was this in in your recovery or in your uh, getting through what you found yourself in? Can you kind of elaborate on how this may have influenced your healing process?
Yes, another excellent question. Faith has always been a very deep part of my upbringing and my family's. And I found the urge to pray almost to be a primal force. It's been said that there are no atheists in foxholes. I would also say there are no atheists in ICUs. I prayed every day, every prayer that I could remember, and I promised God that if I got through this, I would work to make the world a better place and to help other people. And so it played a very big role and continues to play a very big role now, and I've kept my promise.
Mm, wow. I when I retired from my pastorate of 32 years from the same church, one of the things I wanted to do was continue my ministry by doing something that I thought would be encouraging, inspiring, and hopefully transforming to folks. So I started the podcast. Now I've probably been doing it now for maybe over a year and a half, close going on 2 years. I've done over close to 180 interviews with guests, and I wanted to always interview folk who I thought have gone through something, could share how they went through it, could talk about it from a viewpoint of what they could share to help somebody along the way. So, what I want to ask you now, because there are people listening to this podcast because of what the podcast is all about, who are going through something. I just attended a funeral on past Saturday and talked with one of my members of the church that I'm serving as interim pastor. And she says, it's difficult. I'm trying to move through it. People are hurting and they're going through some real struggles in life. And society now is even seemingly making it even more difficult. What would you share to or say to them that would be encouraging, would be inspiring, and hopefully transforming uh, for them in their life?
Excellent question. Um, I think as succinctly as I can state it, the website I called Acknowledge, Accept, and Adapt is really the culmination of many years of being a physician. Over those years, I had to give a lot of bad news to patients, and I noticed that the ones that could accept the diagnosis, um, I was able to help.
Hmm.
If you can't admit what's going on,
Wow.
then there's really not much hope of moving forward. Once you get to acceptance of the situation in life, you have to get to acceptance. You have to, you have to avoid being angry. Being angry doesn't help anything. You can't go back. You can't bring back the past. So acknowledging the issue, accepting it, not being angry. And the hardest step was adapt, moving forward. And life and dying are a part of the human experience. We don't know how much time we have. We don't know how it's going to transpire, but at some point we all do die. And I've been touched by death in my own life. My parents died when I was young. My brother's son died during the pandemic when he was 22.
Hmm.
Um, and it's been very, very hard. And I think that the best advice I can give is to accept the situation as it is, not get drawn into anger, it doesn't help. Forgiveness and then acceptance is how you move forward. It's a
Wow.
slow process, but it's the best advice I can give.
Well said. Well said. And I know listeners of this podcast will take that to heart. It's good information. I am just so amazed by your story. It's really awesome. Listeners, don't go to place. We're going to come back with a couple of more um, questions and discussion from Dr. Hession. So please stay with us. But first of all, I want to ask Dr. Hudson if you could share with listeners of this podcast a little bit about how they can get your book, share the name of it, where they can get it, and if they need more information on you, how can they get obtain that information?
Sure, James, thank you. The name of the book is Physician Heal Thyself, Nearly Dead, My Journey Back to Health.
Hmm.
It's available on Amazon and hopefully shortly after that in bookstores. But the primary route of distribution will be through Amazon. And I have a website, Acknowledge, Accept, and Adapt. I'll be publishing a monthly blog, and it's interactive. Questions can be submitted, and I'll answer and communicate with whoever wishes to speak with me about their particular concerns. Um, I think that life is hard and change is hard, and learning not to be angry about what life throws at you is important. I remember a lesson my father told me when I was very young. Said I kept thinking, why couldn't I be a better athlete? Why couldn't I be smarter? Why couldn't I be this? Why couldn't I be that? He said, son, the cards you're dealt in life are the cards you're dealt in life.
Hmm.
Your job is to play them as best you can.
Hmm. Well said.
And, you know, those words have stayed with me.
Hmm. Hmm. I love it. I love it. You know, I don't know what to say. You have me spellbound today. Your story is so powerful and compelling until it obviously touches you, and it touches me specifically because I feel where you are. I feel what you went through. You know, I've had two major surgeries myself. One, I was had 8 hour surgery that was straightening my spine. I had scoliosis, and it was giving me so much pain. So going through some of the same stuff that you talk about, I really feel it, and I'm sitting here trying to hold back tears because you're really amazing. I When I was going through my difficulties, and that's way back when I committed a serious crime as a result of I was a gambler and did something stupid. Uh, but I had some good support. Uh, my family was there for me, friends that I still have, even my law school friends, my lawyers that I practice with are still very close. We're still meet and talk, discuss politics and other stuff. So I want to ask you, how did you, you know, feel, or did you have the support from your loved ones, your wife and, family, friends, and how did uh, that relationship, you know, contribute to your recovery? Can you share a little bit about that?
Yes, that's a very insightful question. And it's a powerful one that I speak throughout my book. As I said, I dedicated the book to my wife, Colleen, my soulmate. She saved my life. Um, I woke during the night struggling to breathe. She'd already been awakened by my labored breathing, called 911, got me to the hospital. And I wasn't really able to make any decisions. I was barely really able to, I wasn't able to speak. I could hear, but everything was fragmented. My whole being was focused on breathing. So she made all the difficult decisions. She made the decision to put me on life support. And when they said I was not responding to the treatment, she agreed to the high risk transfer to get me into a Boston teaching hospital, specifically Brigham Women's. And it was there my life was saved.
Hmm.
My wife, my sons, my two sons, my two brothers, James and Paul, my sister Maureen, they stayed with me around the clock, 24 hours a day when I was in the intensive care unit at the Brigham. They never left my side.
Hmm.
They would talk to me. They didn't know if I could hear them or not. I could. Um, their voices kept me sane. Their
Hmm.
presence kept me sane. Their strength gave me hope.
Hmm.
My recovery was a long one, and they stayed by me. They supported me. They supported each other. Our friends helped as well. And it was that family connection, the strong personal friends that I've had over the years. We supported one another. Um, my wife had asked our church to pray for me. She had the whole congregation praying for me daily. She started a prayer chain. Um, she really helped save my life.
Hmm. I can feel that. Uh, I I know what that's like because I had my mom was there for me, pray for me, and all of this gives you a reason to not give up, and because you know that there's somebody there that you want to really come back to, and I feel that really coming from you. That's it's very powerful and very compelling. Um, you know, I don't know. It's you got so much that I could talk about and ask you about, but maybe I'll just ask you this question. In your book, you mentioned the challenges and of transitioning from a physician to a patient. And I think that hit me because I I'm I'm thinking about my own life, how I transitioned from a lawyer to a pastor. So, it's those things can happen. Can you elaborate? Can you share more about this experience and how it impacted your perspective? In my case, it would be in my ministry. In your case, it would be in healthcare. So tell us a little bit about it.
Another great question. The whole process was beyond difficult. Um, I understood as a physician what was going on, and I knew I was in deep trouble, and I was very much afraid. But I was powerless to do anything, and I had to accept that. And when I finally got off the ventilator after 11 plus days, it was a struggle to stay off the ventilator. My lungs were in very bad shape. Um, Once I was stable enough to breathe on my own, they tried to get me up and they realized I was paralyzed from the neck down from a complication of a viral illness called Guillain-Barré syndrome. And I couldn't go home. I was sent to rehabilitation hospital and Spalding Hospital. And I remember the day I arrived on the floor, the spinal cord injury floor. And that really just kind of was like a gut punch. Um, my biggest fear in life had been being paralyzed. And here I was.
Hmm.
Um, and I had to learn to be a patient. I couldn't think of a doctor. I couldn't act like a doctor. And I learned how difficult it is to be a doctor, how very difficult it is to be a patient. It's a lot easier to be a doctor.
Hmm.
Um, and I had to trust in other people. And the trust had to be, fully committed trust. And over time, I learned the difference between, got a lot of get well cards and visitors. And I could learn that I could understand the difference between, I learned to understand that the nuanced difference between sympathy and empathy. When you've been through a terrible illness, you can relate to people differently than if you're just feeling bad for their situation.
Hmm.
One of the techniques that they had recommended I learn when I was in rehabilitation was meditation, um, to calm my mind and to control anxiety about the slow progress of my recovery. And it's like anything, whether it's learning to play baseball, learning to play golf, or learning to play the piano, it took a long time to master. I'm still working at it, but the mindfulness meditation taught me to be present, fully present with my patients. Um, as you know, you've been a patient yourself. Doctors are very busy because they're constantly interrupted by
Hmm.
phone calls, by beepers going off, and they can get distracted. What the mindfulness meditation taught me was to be fully present, to block everything out, and to be totally focused on the patient in front of me 100%. And it was really this experience of being a patient that made me a better doctor and a better person.
I can understand. I do hear that. Well, it's getting ready to close, but I do want to ask you to briefly just tell those who may just pick up your book, and hopefully there will be some who will really get it and be inspired by it. But what do you hope they will take away from your book, uh, and especially those who may be facing their own medical challenges or caring for loved ones in similar situations that you found yourself?
My hope in reading my book, which is really part memoir and part self-help guide, there were no rules or books or anything that I found that could help you recover from a critical medical illness. I used my own personal story as a physician and a patient. I described in detail what worked for me. I talk about the depression that came with this illness, with the post-traumatic stress disorder that came with critical medical illness, which is not really well talked about. I mean, PTSD is discussed as a consequence of war and violence, but it's also a very common consequence of critical medical illness. And post-traumatic growth, how you can grow from your illness. And I hope my hope is that people can find some solace and some guideposts that will help them through the unknown of a critical medical illness or being a loved one of someone who's going through a critical medical illness, and showing them how, giving them some clues based on what my experience was and how they too can get through it. In the book, my wife wrote an afterword, my wife's perspective, and she talks about how she got through this and what a spouse of a loved one or a family member of a loved one can do to help support um, someone going through a critical medical illness. So my hope is that at least one person can be made better off by my experience.
Thank you so much. Dr. Hession, this is an awesome interview. I've enjoyed my time spending with you today, and I'm certain that listeners of this podcast will gain some insight and just will really be inspired, encouraged just by hearing what you have had to say. Uh, and again, I want to say thank you for uh, agreeing to be a guest on this podcast.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith, for having me. It's been a pleasure.
And there you have it, Dr. Michael Hession, the author of Physician Heal Thyself. Awesome interview, and we're grateful to have had him share with us today. And until next time, peace and blessings be with each of you.